Hey, and welcome while we read about the Compromise of 1850. There's been a lot of people who have, a lot of historians who have said that if there's any one single biggest mess up in the the attempt to avoid the American Civil War, it would be passing the Compromise of 1850 because a lot of things were not good here. So this is one of the most uh, important causes of the American Civil War. Basically, this makes the Missouri Compromise dead. The Missouri Compromise basically doesn't matter anymore after this. And it was introduced to the Senate on January 29th, 1850. So, the Compromise of 1850 was made up of 5 bills that attempted to resolve disputes over slavery in new territories added to the United States in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, which, if you remember, was 1846 to 1848. Did a few things. It admitted California as a free state. It left Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves if they were going to be a slave state or free state, meaning they're going to get to vote for themselves on this. It defined a new Texas-New Mexico boundary, and it made it easier for slave owners to recover their runaways under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, we're not going to have a page reading where we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 because it's included in the Compromise of 1850. But if there's anything that makes the abolitionists in the North angry and the Southern slaves terrified, it's the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It's firewood being thrown onto a fire. It's kindling being thrown onto a fire. The Compromise of 1850 was masterminded by Whig Senator Henry Clay and Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas. Lingering resentment over its provisions contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War. It's a cause of the American Civil War. The Mexican-American War was a result of U.S. President James K. Polk's belief that it was America's manifest destiny to spread across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. Following the U.S. victory, Mexico lost about 1/3 of its territory, including nearly all of present-day California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. A national dispute arose as to whether or not slavery was going to be permitted in these new territories. So, the Compromise of 1850 was made up of 5 separate bills that basically eventually became 5 different laws, but together they were all called the Compromise of 1850 because they were all passed together. First off, it permitted slavery in Washington, D.C. Slavery is allowed in Washington, D.C. This way, Southern slave owners that became members of Congress could bring their slaves with them. However, slave trade in Washington, D.C. was going to be outlawed. So you could no longer buy or sell slaves in Washington, D.C. California is added to the Union as a free state. Utah and New Mexico were territories, but these territories would be allowed to use popular sovereignty. They get to use their own power, sovereignty. They're going to do it popularly. They're going to get to vote. So they were going to vote by popular vote on whether or not they would have slavery. Popular sovereignty is going to play a role in future events. It defined new boundaries for the state of Texas following the Mexican-American War, removing its claims to parts of New Mexico, but awarding the state $10 million in compensation. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required citizens to assist in apprehending runaway slaves and denied enslaved people a right to trial by jury. So first off, if you break the law, you're a slave, you break the law and you run away. You don't get a trial by jury because you're not a person. Second off, if you are an abolitionist in the North, or anyone in the North, or anyone ever in all of America, if it's found out that you know about a runaway slave, and you don't help the slave owner get their property back, if you just let that runaway slave keep going, if you hide that runaway slave, if you help that runaway slave in any way, even something as small as just keeping your mouth shut, you too have broken federal law and can go to prison for it. You must help return their stolen slave property. Consequences of the Compromise of 1850. Well, the biggest one is this one, a new, stricter fugitive slave law. Congress passed a strict fugitive slave law which required officials in all states and territories to assist with the return of enslaved people who had escaped to freedom or pay a substantial fine. You had to pay money for this. Ordinary citizens were also required to assist in the recapturing escapees or face fine or imprisonment. They could put you in jail. There were no safeguards to prevent opportunists from claiming that any person of any African descent, including free black citizens of the North, was an escapee. You have a neighbor and they happen to be African American. You don't like them. They have a bigger, nicer house than you. You want it, but you can't afford it. Just claim that they're a runaway slave. No one in their family's ever been a slave before. But once you've made that accusation, as long as the right person is in charge of the local police, they go arrest them, haul them back down south. All you have to do is say, they're a runaway slave, and I'm pretty sure they belong to so-and-so down south. So-and-so down south doesn't care that it's not true. So-and-so down south is like, I got a free slave. Cool. Abuse. Admission of California as a free state. To balance the Fugitive Slave Act's concession to the South, Congress admitted California as a free state. Popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah territories. Congress avoided a direct decision on the question of slavery in the new territory of New Mexico and the territory of Utah, employing the principle of popular sovereignty. Let the voters decide. This allowed white residents of the territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery or not. There's also a ban on slave trading in Washington, D.C. Anti-slavery advocates welcomed Congress's ban on the slave trade in Washington, D.C., although slavery itself did continue to be legal there. So if we're going to make this all very, very simple, basically in the North, they got two big things. California becomes a free state. Yay! Representation in the Senate. Slave trade, but not slavery, is abolished in D.C. That's what the North gets. The South, what do they get? The remainder of Mexican cession land, the land that we got from Mexico after the end of the Mexican-American War, all of it, including the stuff north of the Missouri Compromise line, all of that can now be slave land. You just have to get enough people there to vote. And there's also the really big one, stricter fugitive slave laws. Got to give those slaves back to their owners. I hope you're learning, and I hope you're having fun.